Okay, good afternoon, everyone. As you might have just noticed, um, I just posted the extra credit assignments on Blackboard. So you can see it right here. And the extra credit assignment will be due on May 3rd. Make sure that I wrote down the correct due date. Yeah, I think I need to update this. Just give me 1 second and apply the right due date here. So I'm gonna upload this updated version. Of the assignment. After we are in the spring. So it will be due on May 3rd by midnight. And for your information, this class will be recorded today because I plan on posting it to my 2 o'clock class because I can't do that class today. So I'll be recording this class. Just wanted to let you know. Okay, so let me, because I don't want students to ask me about the due date for this one. So let's have it written in the assignment itself. Okay, now I can upload the new one. It's out there. Same structure like the first assignment. You just need to watch 2 small documentaries and write a small review about them. So one about Keynes and the other one about financial crisis. I think they are more interesting and more maybe fun to watch than the previous one. The previous one was a little bit sad, talking about the Great Depression. So you might get, a little depressed. But over here, they are more, so to speak, got some animation in one of them and more lively things, discussed in these 2 documentaries. So you need to write just small reflection paper, maybe a page and a half. It's up to you how much you want to write. That's flexible. You just need to write a good essay, good reflections on these documentaries. You don't want to write summaries. You just want to reflect on how that is related to what's going on today and what's going on and what we did in class. Okay, so today we will continue the discussion we started last time on the money supply and money demand. So we discussed how the Fed creates money using these 3 traditional tools. I say traditional because these are the ways the Fed used to use to basically affect the money supply before the 2008 crisis. But things changed after 2008 a little bit. The Fed, got involved into the private sector, or private banking sector directly by buying debt from troubled banks. And during the pandemics, also, the Fed was actually criticized for, buying huge amount of short-term government debt and other sort of debt instruments like municipal debts and corporate debt directly. So, but the key concept is the same. The impact on the money supply is the same. So we said last time that open market operations basically refers to the Fed actions of buying and selling securities. So it's important to know that when the Fed buys securities, it increases the money supply. And when it sells securities, it actually decreases the money supply. The other day I was reading an article about the Senate member, forgot his name. He was, criticizing the chair of the Fed on, excessive buying of debt. So he said that will trigger inflation. There was like some debate on this. So basically, the Senate member was concerned about the Fed buying too much debt, and so the Fed was okay. That's not going to cause inflation. We know what we're doing. And the second tool is changing the required reserve ratio. I think last time we did an example. We would go over it very quickly today, and then we would do other two examples involving money market, open market operations, and borrowing from the Fed. The third tool is, the Fed can lend money to banks, and in order to lend out them money, they lend them out money at a discount rate, an interest rate that is referred to as the discount rate, the rate at which these banks borrow money from the Fed. So when the Fed wants to extend more liquidity in the market, it can cut the discount rate or the interest rate at which banks borrow from the Fed to increase loans extensions to these banks, and therefore that will affect money supply. So you see that money supply always starts as in debt creation, right? So when the Fed buys government debt or lends out money to banks. Okay, so last time we tried to work on this example in here. We have two panels. The required reserve ratio is 20%, and this is determined by the Fed. So money supply, we're using M1 to measure money supply. Money supply using M1 definition of money supply is currency in circulation. You get that from the bank balance, from the Fed's balance sheet, plus demand deposits, or deposits for short. So money supply using M1, currency plus deposits, you get 600. So let's see what happens when the Federal Reserve wants to increase the money supply by decreasing the required reserve ratio. Let's assume that the Fed cuts the required reserve ratio to 12.5% instead of 20%. In this case, so now banks will have excess reserves. They can lend out more money out of their deposits. Okay, so the question becomes, okay, over here, notice that nothing changed in the Fed's balance sheet, everything the same. Reserves are the same. And loans will change in here. So the question is, you want the required reserve ratio to be equal to 12.5%. Question you want to ask yourself. So reserves divided by deposits should be equal to 12.5%. So reserves didn't change in here, so they're fixed. The question is how deposits should change to maintain this required reserve ratio. So new loans will be created, and therefore you can rearrange this, get deposits is equal to 100 divided by 12.5%, which is equal to 800. That's one way to think about it. The other way, there are different ways to think about it. Maybe think about intuitive way to think about this situation. So calculate the money multiplier. The money multiplier in this case is 1 over the required reserve ratio, 1 divided by R, which is the required reserve ratio. So the required reserve ratio now is 12.5%. So 1 divided by 12.5% is 8. So the money multiplier is 8, which means that for every dollar increase in reserves, deposit will increase by 8. Deposit or money supply, because deposit is part of money supply. So money supply will increase by 8, by the multiple of 8. So if the deposit, if reserve is 100, so if reserve is equal to 100, then deposit should equal to the multiplier multiplied by the amount of reserves. In this case, the new multiplier is 8. The amount of reserves is 100. Therefore, deposit will be 800. So this bank will increase the amount of loans by 300. Initially, we had 400 in loans plus 300, that would be 700. And these loans will create an equal amount of deposit. So add 300 to the deposits, which came from the new loans. So you have 800 in here. Class, do you have any question about this slide? Because the discussion here would be important to understand what's going on in the next one. So before I move to the next way the Fed can use to create money, is this clear? Any questions? Okay, so let's jump to the third, the first, or the open market operation example. So I'm going to jump to the open market operations. Notice that this PowerPoint is slightly different from the previous one. I just made some changes to it. I just added these examples. And the good news is maybe I won't ask you to do all these steps in the exam. So you will see some of the balance sheet in the final exam, but I will ask you to do less calculations, maybe things like calculate the required reserve ratio, calculate the multiplier, and calculate the excess reserves if there's excess reserves. Okay, so let's do the open market operation, meaning that when the Fed buys or sells securities. So let's assume we have the following. Let's look at the first panel. So in the first panel, we have the balance sheet for the Fed and the balance sheet for commercial banks and the balance sheet for J&Q public, anybody from the general public, you and I. Okay, let's look closely at the balance sheet for the Fed. So the Fed got $100 in securities, part of its asset portfolio, and $80 in currency, that's part of liabilities, and $20 in reserves. These are commercial banks reserves coming from here. They are part of the Fed's liability. So this commercial bank got, these commercial banks altogether got $20 in reserves, $100 in deposits, and therefore they can make 80 loans. Asset is equal to liability plus net worth. 100 in liabilities coming from deposits is equal to 20 plus 80 in assets, reserves plus loans. So let's look at this typical balance sheet for Jane. So Jane got $5 in deposits. So these $5 are included here. She got 0 debt. That's good. And $5 in net worth. Asset is equal to liability plus net worth. In this example, we assume that the required reserve ratio is the same, is basically, it's not changing. So R is equal to 20%. Keep that in mind because we're not changing it. We're using another tool. So check reserves divided by deposits. 20 divided by 100, you get 20%. So this required reserve ratio is met. So let's see what happens when the Fed sells securities. Again, before we do any kind of calculations, when the Fed sells securities, it decreases the money supply. It's taking the security out of, actually taking cash out of the market and replacing it by securities, by government bonds. So let's assume that the Fed now buys $5 in securities. So we're working now with panel 2. So when the Fed sells $5 in securities, so securities would go down by $5. So initially we had $100 in securities. Now the Fed sold $5 of securities. So we'll adjust its reserve. So reserves will go down by 5. Currency is the same. Also just adjust its accounts in here. So let's see what happens to the Jane's balance sheet. So now the composition of assets will change for Jane. So she used to have deposit in the amount of $5. Now she bought $5 in securities. She used the deposit, the cash she had in her bank account to buy the securities. So deposit will go down to 0 because she used that $5 to buy $5 in securities. And notice that net worth is the same. Didn't change, same thing. Okay, only the composition of assets changed in this case. Let's see what happens to the bank's balance sheet. So now the bank deposit will go down by 5 initially. So Jane's $5 used to be part of the $100 deposits. So now that $5 was was used to buy securities. Therefore, deposits will go down by 5. 100 minus 5, you get 95. And this will be deducted from reserves here, not from loans. You can't take it out of loans. It's going to be taken out of reserves. So now we have less reserves, and therefore money supply will decrease by the money multiplier. Now, so why this is not the end of the story? Why panel 2 is not the end of the story? The reason is very simple. Notice that, check the required reserve ratio in here. So if you divide 15 by 95, you find out the reserve ratio. So the reserve ratio will be, you guys can divide it on your phone. I'm going to do it here. So 15 divided by 95 is 15.78%. So reserves, the ratio here is 15. You write it down. R, this is R is the required reserve ratio, but reserves ratio will be 15 over here divided by 95. Now this bank should adjust its amount of loans to maintain the required reserve ratio. The required reserve ratio is supposed to be 20%, and this bank is not meeting that required reserve ratio. So if it keeps it as is, it will have problem with the Fed. The Fed will tell them, okay, you guys need to decrease the amount of loans to meet the required reserve ratio, not abiding by the regulation. So the question is, by how much loans should decrease in order to maintain the required reserve ratio? Let's assume that you work for that bank. Okay. So there are different ways to look at it. Maybe you can ask yourself, the question is, okay, this is the required reserve ratio I'm supposed to meet. So the required reserve ratio is the same, it's 20%. And you want the amount of reserves divided by deposits to equal to 20%. So you can calculate deposit, just cross multiply and rearrange. So deposit should be equal to reserves divided by 20%. So in our example, deposit and loans should decrease by, now reserves is 15 divided by 20%. So you get 75. So you see here, deposit should be 75, and the amount of loans will go down by 20. Okay. So another way to look at this, you can write this same equation, this one. Remember that this is R. This is the required reserve. So you can write this as deposit is equal to reserves multiplied by 1 over R. So why I wrote it this way? Because 1 over R is the multiplier. So I can write here, instead of this, M for multiplier. So for every dollar change in reserves, money supply will increase by the multiplier. So in this case, go back to this example, same one. So the multiplier is M is 1 over R. So R is 20%. So 1 divided by 20% is 5. So the money multiplier is 5. And reserves now is 15 multiplied by 5. You get 75, same thing. So notice that when the Fed sold $5 in securities, money supply changed by 25. So it used to be 100. Now it's less by 25. So now it's 75 in deposits. So M1 in the first panel includes currency in circulation plus deposits, banks deposits. 100 plus 80, you get 180. That's M1. And now M1 becomes currency is not, the bank is, the Fed is not printing any new money. Currency is the same, but the amount of deposits went down by 25. Okay, the quick way to do this, instead of doing all these things, what you can do is, so since the Fed sold securities by the amount of 5, reserves would go down by 5, and the money multiplier is 5. So money supply or deposits will go down by 25. So it was 100 minus 25, you get 75. Any questions about this slide? Questions, comments? Everything is good? Okay, so let's see what happens when the Fed extend loans to commercial banks. And the same thing, is going to happen. So the Fed, for example, gives a $20 in loans, and the money multiplier is 5. Money supply would increase by 5 multiplied by 20, which is 100. So that summarizes everything we're going to do next. Okay, so in this example, let's look at the first panel first. So we have the balance sheet for the Fed and the balance sheet for commercial banks. So in this example, the Fed got 160 in securities, 80 in reserves, and 80 in currency. So this is the amount of reserves. So this is currency in circulation. So everything is balanced for the Fed. Let's look at the balance sheet for this commercial bank. So this commercial bank, again, we are assuming that the required reserve ratio in this example, again, is 20%. We assume that R is 20%. So this bank got 400 in deposits. Therefore, it's required to keep 20% of it in reserves. 20% out of 400 is 80 kept at the Fed. And the difference basically is the amount of loans. 320 in loans. Okay. Now let's look at the money supply. So money supply is currency in circulation, 80 plus deposits, 400. So we get 480. We're using M1, only deposits, demand deposits, and currency in circulation. Let's see what happens when the Fed extends $20 in loans to commercial banks. Okay, so the Fed will create a loan out of nowhere in the amount of $20 and will add it to the asset side of its balance sheet. So you see here, so when Bernanke was asked where the bailout money came from, was it tax money? Because even Congress members weren't like clear what's going on. And he said, no, it was a computer stroke. And they said, what? It was a computer stroke, so that's it. So what they did, they adjusted the account. So they created loan to the banks by the amount of $20 in this example. And added an equal amount to reserves here. So reserves was 80, now it's 100, 80 plus 20. Currency is the same. You notice that on all these examples, the Fed affects the money supply without printing a penny. Now let's see what happens to the balance sheet of the commercial banks. So now commercial banks owe $20 in liability to the Fed. So they add this $20 to the liability side. So this is not deposit by you and I. This is a loan. These banks owe to the Fed. So they deposit this money, and then reserves would go up by 20. Used to be 80, now it's 100. So now these banks can make loans out of these borrowed money from the Fed. By how much? We see in a second. I mean, you can see that reserves increased by 20. The money multiplier is 5. So therefore, money supply will increase by 20 multiplied by 5 by 100. So it was 400, now it will become 500. And this bank can lend out $100 in loans. So we can follow the same steps we did before to calculate the change in deposits. So we can use any of these formulas here. So now deposit reserve is now is 100. And the required reserve ratio is same, is 20%. So the deposit will be equal to 500. Or you can just multiply the reserves 100 by the money multiplier. The money multiplier in this case is 5. You get 500, same thing. And now, because reserves increased by 20%, by $20, deposit will increase by the multiplier multiplied by change in reserve, $20. So we increase by 100. Therefore, this bank can lend out, extend loans by the amount of 420. 320 plus 100 is 420. So this 420 refers to the new amount of loans, nothing else. Looks like whoever wrote this textbook was kind of a little high. Okay, guys, do you have any questions about this slide? So you see, when the Fed extended loans by the amount of $20, the amount of money supply increased by 100 because the money multiplier is 5. So the loans extended increased the amount of reserves, and therefore money supply increased by multiples. Okay, so the Fed can use these 3 tools to affect the money supply in the economy. So what I mean by money supply, basically we look at the relationship between the rate of interest I and money, the amount of money supply. So we use M1 in this case. I'm just going to write N. So keep in mind is using M1. Okay, so notice that the Fed can set interest rate or can set the money supply independent of the rate of interest. So it doesn't depend on the rate of interest. So the Fed can set it here, here, or here, whatever it pleases, using these 3 tools. So for example, in the first example, let's assume that money supply was here at 400, and the Fed extended loans to banks in the amount of $20. So banks will be happy because now they can lend out $100 out of that $20 they got from the Fed. That's kind of weird. You say, how can the banks like create loans out of $20, more loans than $20? They care about the reserves. So now their reserves increase by 20, and therefore they have excess reserves. They can increase the amount of loans. So then the money supply, so I'm going to write here M as for money supply. Will increase by to 500. And again, remember, and when the Fed buys or sells securities, so in our previous example, so money supply was 100, and when the Fed bought $5 in securities, money supply decreased by 25, so we ended up with 75. You know, excluding the currency, you can add currency in circulation to it, but I'm looking at here and changing deposits. And the same is true when changing the required reserve ratio. So if you remember from previous example, so deposits were 500, and when the Fed cuts the reserve ratio to 12.5, money supply increased by 300. So the amount of deposits went up to 800. So the money supply, you know, like any other supply curve, you're looking at the relationship between quantity supplied and the price. The price of money here is the interest rate. When you want to borrow money, the price you pay is the rate of interest. So in this model, we assume that money supply is vertical. So why is vertical? Because it's, you know, we assume it's independent, or Fed's action are independent of interest rate. And we assume that Feds create money. But there are some other theories we don't do in here, in which actually this is the name for this theory is the verticalist monetary theory. Verticalist because we have a vertical money supply. We have other theories that called horizontalist. And you have maybe Calexian theories where you have this sort of money supply. We don't do this in here. We believe over here using a model in which only the Fed creates money. So in this example, like, money supply, banks can create money. And as you extend more loans or increase money supply, risk will increase and therefore interest rate will go up with it. So we don't want to do this in here. So far, what I would like you to understand is in this simple model, money supply is determined by the Federal Reserve and is vertical. In order to understand how interest rate is determined, we need to understand or introduce the demand for money. So what do I mean by demand for money? If I ask you the question, what is your demand for money? You might say it's infinite. Give me an infinite amount of money. No, that's not the right answer to the right question. So by money demand or demand for money, basically we mean how much of your financial assets you prefer or you want to keep in liquid or in cash. Liquid asset, because if you have checking account, that's also very liquid, in liquid asset. Okay, so let's assume that Brian got a certain good chunk of money, maybe $1 million in cash, maybe $2 million, $3 million, whatever. So is it a good idea for Brian to keep all of it in cash? Do people do that in real life? People with money? Well, they try to allocate, that money. Because if you keep it in cash, first of all, you're not making any money out of it. You can make interest rate on it, at least, without taking any risk. So if interest rate is 1%, you can make, I think, $10,000. $10,000 a year. That's a good amount of money, even if interest rate is 1%. So if interest rate is 5%, then you can make $50,000 per year. Okay, just without doing anything. So you see, this one thing, and so people try to basically allocate their financial assets among maybe things like real estate, maybe invest in maybe saving accounts by saving, all kind of retirement accounts, CDs, IRAs, okay, to make more money out of money. And you also keep a certain amount of money for, precautions, just for the rainy day. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Okay, so we can summarize why people hold money in 3 main points. So the first motive for holding money has to do with, according to Keynes used these terms, transactional motive. Transactional, missing an A here. Transactional motive. What do I mean by transactional motive? People demand money based on their daily transactions. Okay, so so your cash balance people keep. Maybe let's assume that you have the following bills, maybe 2,000 in rent, and then $200 for, or maybe $400 for car expenses, and $600 for food. Okay. Then that determines the amount of money you want to keep in cash to meet these transactions. And notice that when your income goes up, so when income goes up, your demand for money, I'm going to write MD for money demand, goes up. I mean, usually rich people tend to have more money in liquid asset, more money in their bank accounts, and more money in cash. Okay, so we can summarize this in a very simple equation right here. So I'm going to write money demand, MD, depends, is a function of income. So when income goes up, demand for money goes up. So maybe if your income, if you make $3,000 a month and you keep some cash with you, if you make double that amount, your demand for cash increases. That's one way to think about it. The other way, if you want to think about it in terms of macro level, so when output goes up, then the demand money goes up with it. Okay, so sticking with the same example, we're still working with a transactional motive. So let's assume that prices increase. Let's assume that prices double. So maybe in this example, like, say Brian needs to keep at least 2,000 plus 4,000 plus 600. So he needs to keep 3,000, in his bank account or in cash. So maybe he don't want to invest them to meet these transactional motives or hold the money. But let's assume that prices increase, prices double. Now he pays 4,000 in rent and 800 for car expenses. Let's assume that we get very high inflation for whatever reason, and then 1,200 for other expenses. Notice that now he will need 6,000 to meet these transactions. So basically, demand for money also depends on prices. So when prices go up, demand for money goes up. Sometimes this in technical terms referred to as the real balances, theory. This is one way to look at it. So we said so far that the relationship between demand for money and income is positive. So I'm going to put positive sign in here. And is the relationship between demand for money and prices is also positive. So let's put this in a circle. So YMB refers to transactional motive of holding money. Of course, there are some other motives for holding money in cash. And I kept this bracket open here because I want to add another thing. So do people hold money for, according to Keynes, speculative motive, for speculation? So in the case of Brian, he got $1 million in cash. You might say, okay, I can at least earn interest rate on it. right? That's kind of speculation. So people invest in stock market and try to make money more, out of money. So the price, the opportunity cost of having money in cash is the interest rate you forego. So the price of that money is the amount of interest, small I, interest rate. So the speculative motive depends on interest rate. So when interest rate is high, maybe Brian will decide to keep less money in cash and leave the money in a saving account, or maybe buy a bonds and get interest rate. So because it becomes very expensive for him to hold the money in cash, because he will be giving up a lot of, interest rate income. When interest rate is down, like nowadays, it's close to zero. So it doesn't make any difference for Brian to keep the money in cash or leave it in his saving account. So when interest rate goes up, so that will basically give him an incentive to keep it in, to save that money. Okay, so we refer to this motive as the speculative motive. So when interest rate is high, people tend to have less money in cash. And when interest rate is down, people tend to have more money in cash. So I'm going to write I in here for the rate of interest, small I. And I'm going to write negative sign on top of it to remind you that the relationship between money demand and interest rate is negative. So when interest rate goes up, money demand goes down. I mean, think about it the same way, like when you want to borrow money. If you want to borrow money, basically you look at an interest rate, which is the price of money, which is the price of your loan. When interest rate is high, your demand for loans is lower. And remember that in the discussion we had before, loans create deposits. Okay. So the third motive for holding money, we're not gonna include it in this model, which is, according to Keynes, precautionary motive. So precautionary motive is you keep money for the rainy day, for uncertainty, for things you don't know what's going to happen to you. You don't know what the future hides for you in store. So therefore, people keep a certain money. Think about the COVID-19 crisis. So a lot of people didn't have enough savings, and without government help, they would have gone bankrupt. So if you, and who expected the COVID-19 crisis to happen back in 2018 or 19? Everything was wonderful, and so people keep money just for uncertainty, for precaution. These are the three motives for holding money. We'll focus on the first two and include them in the model. Now, that said, we can graph the demand for money equation. So the demand for money, like any other demand, you put the price on the vertical axis, and the price of money, we know it's interest rate. And you put the amount of money, the quantity of money, on the horizontal axis. And we know from previous discussion that the relationship is negative. When interest rate is low, demand for liquid money goes up. You don't want to keep money in the bank and getting, why should you leave the money in a CD account if you're getting only 0.1%? That's the amount of most of CD accounts offer nowadays. But if interest rate goes up, you say, okay, I'm going to leave a good chunk of money in a saving account and get interest rate. Okay, and now if income goes up, we represent that by shifting the demand curve to the right, like any other demand curve. So I'm going to write here MD and MD bar. This is not bar. Okay, so when income goes up, demand for money goes up, and therefore we represent that by shifting the demand for money to the right. And same thing happens when prices go up. Remember, we said that for transactional motives, when prices go up, demand for money will go up. And we represent that by shifting the demand for money to the right. Okay, now the rest is very simple. We just put money supply and money demand together and see how interest rate is determined. So we said that the Fed determines money supply and it's vertical because it's determined by the Fed. So I'm going to write here MS for money supply. And this is money demand. This inversely depends on interest rate. I'm going to write here MD. So you see that interest rate is determined by the interaction between demand for money and supply for money. If the Fed wants to decrease interest rate, it can increase the money supply, and therefore interest rate will go down, equilibrium interest rate, from this level to this level, from I1 to I2. And notice that at this level of interest, initially we have excess supply, and you know what happens when you have excess supply of money. So banks will start like cutting interest rate. Okay, so and interest rate will go down until we get to this equilibrium. If the Fed, on the other hand, wants to decrease the amount of the interest rate, we're talking about equilibrium interest rate, the Fed can implement the policies we just discussed to shift the supply curve to the left, and therefore interest rate goes up. On the other hand, let's hold money demand or money supply fixed, and let's see what happens to interest rate when prices go up. So money demand for money will go up, and therefore equilibrium interest rate will go up. And the same is true for when income goes up. So when income goes up, demand for money will go up, pushing interest rate up as well. So why we need to know what happens to interest rate? Why this matters? Okay, this matters because, as we see in chapter 11, so interest rate affects investment, determines investment. And investment is part of aggregate expenditure. Remember, aggregate expenditure is C plus I plus G. So, for example, if the Fed wants to, the government can affect aggregate expenditure directly through G or through taxes, which affect consumption. And the Federal Reserve can affect investments through interest rate. So, for example, to stimulate the economy in a recession, so the Fed can increase the money supply to decrease interest rate. Using money supply will cut interest rate. So with lower interest rate, investment will be higher, aggregate expenditure will be higher, and therefore equilibrium income will be higher. However, the story is not complete in here. Why? Because let's see why we are not done yet. So let's assume that the Fed cuts interest rate through increasing money supply. Let's assume that the Fed sets interest rate in here. Okay, so we know that interest rate should go to this level. However, with lower interest rate, investment is higher. So right here, the sequence, I for investment, small I for interest rate. These are supposed to be arrows. Let me, instead of annotating, let me type. Maybe that's better. Okay, here. So with small interest rates, small I, it's small I. Okay. Investment will be up, and therefore aggregate expenditure will be up, and therefore equilibrium income will be up. So let me just now put the arrows. So when interest rate is down due to increasing money supply, investment will go up, aggregate expenditure will go up, and equilibrium level of income will go up as well. Okay, so we know that demand for money increases when income goes up. So you see that the process is not done yet. So this will increase maybe a little bit. So we end up maybe at this interest rate right here, because demand for money increased when income went up. Okay. So let's assume that the Fed keeps interest rate, money supply fixed, but the government increases government expenditure. Notice that government expenditure will affect the demand for money and therefore interest rate. And that interest rate will affect investment as well. So let's assume that, for example, that G went up. This means that aggregate expenditure is up, and therefore equilibrium level of income is up. And that will increase the demand for money. So the demand for money will go up to this level, and therefore interest rate will go up. And now because interest rate increased, that will affect investment expenditure. So now I, small I, is up, meaning that investment down, and therefore aggregate expenditure is down, and therefore equilibrium income will go down as well. So now this curve will shift here a little bit because income went down. So we need a framework that captures everything that happens: adjustment in prices, interest rate, and income. That's what we try to do in chapter 11. Okay, for the time being, what I would like to understand is money demand, the three motives we just discussed: the speculative motive, the transactional motive. Transaction includes prices and income. Speculative includes interest rate. We didn't include the We didn't talk about the transaction movie. I think I went beyond class time. I'm sorry about that. I'm so sorry. Maybe I got excited. And thank you for your patience. You guys free to go. Next time we will start working in chapter 11. So I activated chapter 11 assignment if you want to start reading it, and also posted some material on Blackboard. Thank you and have a good day.